Chapter 4, U.S. Army Static Line Jump School, Fort Benning, Georgia. When I arrived at Fort Benning near Columbus, Georgia, it was the beginning of summer, so it was hot and humid. It was a place all branches of the military sent personnel to learn the art of static line jumping. The terrain was familiar to me, with the red clay and tall Georgia pine trees all around the base. It was more normal to me than the Texas landscape. It felt kind of nice to be back in familiar territory, even though I didn't look forward to the training. The barracks in the Air Force were not that nice, comparable to a college dorm room, but the Army barracks were a complete shithole. It was my first experience at an Army base, and I was not impressed. The rooms of the barracks didn't even have doors on them. The buildings on the base seemed about 30 years older than the Air Force's, and they actually made the Air Force barracks seem like the Hilton Hotel. I heard C-130s flying around all day. A distinct roar that was heard constantly around the area, with different classes jumping every day. There were about 50 to 60 people going through the Airborne jump training with my class. Most were with the Airborne Division of the Army, which included Rangers, but there were also all other branches of special operations sprinkled in. Static line jumping was very dangerous compared to halo jumps we would do later in the pipeline. The parachutes that were called T-10 Delta parachutes were a very thin green material, circular in shape. They were used by the Army to get troops on the ground fast in World War II and were still used during the training at the time I was going through. Parachutes were very basic, and despite what the Army claimed, we weren't able to control the chute once in the air. If you really needed to change direction of the landing path, grasping one side of the lines and slowly pulling down, like climbing a rope, would angle the chute and hopefully change the path slightly. It was called pulling a slip. Pulling a slip meant you were heading for danger, like power lines, trees, or other jumpers, so I really didn't want to do it. The course was 4 weeks long. The first 3 weeks were spent standing around in the heat, in our field BDUs, and a large helmet, learning how to do a parachute landing fall, or PLF. Because the chutes were thin and the purpose of static line jumping was to get on the ground fast from a low altitude jump, the jumper fell at a rate of 20 feet per second. That meant landing would not be a soft landing like in Halo. It was a fall to the ground. Landing on one leg meant it would probably break. I heard of many guys with pins in their legs, like the one Bronson brought up before the orientation course. It was easy to break a bone and happened at least one person every class, it seemed like. Unlike Halo or traditional skydiving where the jumper pulls a ripcord, our parachutes were hooked to a long cable in the plane by a long strap connected to the parachute. The strap was connected to a long metal cable that ran through the center of the C-130, or C-17. When the jumper exited the plane, the strap immediately pulled the chute open. In order to land properly and safely, we practiced PLFs for an entire week, just standing on the ground. It was a long and tedious time just standing around. We eventually moved to small blocks about 3 feet high that we jumped off of hundreds of times. We were shown a proper PLF. It was hard to do while not falling through the air. From a standing position, we fell to our side, pulling our arms in tight, feet and knees together, rolling to the side of our legs, then to the side of our back, and we followed through until our feet were in the air. It made sense, but I usually heard it went feet, ass, and then head. We heard from the beginning of the course until we were standing at the opening of the side of the plane, staring at the ground moving beneath us, to keep our feet and knees together and never look down. The next 2 weeks were not much more exciting than the first, as we progressed to practicing PLS from a mock plane at ground level to learn how to exit the plane. After all that, we moved to a mock plane in the air with a cable out the side. We exited the plane and rode the cable like a zip line. In a way, it was like an amusement park. We stood around in line, sometimes for hours, and took a ride down a zip line several times. I wasn't really afraid of heights, but the mock plane was about 50 feet in the air, making me a tad nervous. I heard from trainees ahead of me in the pipeline that Airborne and survival school were a joke and very easy. The Airborne instructors, called Black Hats, treated the physical training like it was difficult. The Black Hats mostly dealt with the Army infantry, so they tried to be intimidating, making the runs hard and the calisthenics difficult. They wanted Airborne school to be special, and I understood that. It may have been for the Army, but for us 3 combat controllers and 15 Navy SEALs attending the course, it was just an annoying check in the box. We needed 5 jumps to move on to bigger and better things. After going through the gut check at Lackland, Airborne school was a breeze. Myself, Bronson, and Maggio stuck together. We stood out from the infantry with our clothes. During the physical training exercises, we wore our brown t-shirts, black short shorts, and low-cut socks. The Army had on gray shirts, long blue shorts, and tall white socks. I felt like we stood out, but the Navy SEALs, dressed in the same workout gear as us, made us able to stay away from the attention of the Army Black Hats for the most part, because the SEALs gained a lot of attention. As we formed up for the morning workouts, I began to feel like one of the SEALs, as they welcomed us 3 CCTs into their group. It began to feel like it was us against the rest of the Army. We were dressed the same and treated the same because the Black Hats didn't know a SEAL from a CCT in our workout gear. We were our own community, and for the most part, we were left alone by the Black Hats, screaming at people during the runs and physical training. I could tell the SEALs had little respect for the course. They made sarcastic comments about everything and laughed under their breath. "Are you guys CCT?" one of the SEALs asked us. "Hoo-yah," we responded. Hoo-yah meant a lot of things in the special ops community. Yes, no, maybe, or anything when used in the right context. "Hell yeah," the SEAL shouted. I didn't say much to the group of highly trained warriors, and was actually in disbelief that I was at jump school with actual SEALs that had graduated buds. They were the guys I wanted to be a short time before, and had somehow gotten into a program that made me a peer in their group. "How was Budge?" Bronson asked one of the SEALs. Bronson smiled at the SEAL, who was shaving his face with a cheap razor blade that he kept in his pocket. The Black Hats kept asking him if he had shaved. He had heavy facial hair and had 5 o'clock shadow by noon every day. He was tired of the nagging and decided to bust out the razor periodically throughout the day. The SEAL looked at Bronson and showed little emotion. "It sucked," he said. "I never want to do it again." All the SEALs looked about like us. None of them looked weak or unconfident. They didn't look superhuman, but there was an inner strength possessed by every one of them, an inner strength we were already developing in the CCT pipeline. Many had the same short, stocky build as myself, but a few were taller and skinnier. On a long, boring run, before an even more boring day of learning to fall, we ran with the SEALs and the Army Infantry during our morning workout PT session. The Black Hats sang in the front, and we repeated, "From the east to the west, hoo-ha, hoo-ha, airborne, airborne." I looked up to see one of the SEALs running backwards, holding his groin with one hand, and the other in the air like Michael Jackson. He had a mustache that was bigger than any regulation in the military would allow. "Hey, fucking Navy," the Black Hat shouted at the SEAL. Black Hat was a short, soft-looking guy wearing his black hat proudly. Without being asked, the SEAL dropped down and did what must have been 50 push-ups. The group and I ran slowly away from him, and I wondered when he would stop. Bronson let out his crazy leprechaun laugh while watching the confused Black Hat staring at the guy doing push-ups. "Hurry up!" was all the Black Hat could manage to yell. A few minutes later, the SEAL appeared back in the slow run formation without the slightest hint of being out of breath. Some of the Army infantry were getting winded on the run. They took the opportunity to stop and watch the SEAL doing push-ups and slow down to a walk. As I zigzagged to run slow enough for the pace, I heard, "Get in line, Navy!" One of the SEALs was doing sprints in the opposite direction away from the formation. "I'll show you a formation," the SEAL leader, a stocky man that looked like an NFL lineman, said. He dropped down to the push-up position as well. The rest of the SEALs dropped down and began doing push-ups, so all 3 of us combat controllers dropped down with them. I felt a little odd defying what the Army told us to do, but I also felt exhilarated going against the asshole with authority. Bronson began to laugh as we reached 20 push-ups. He wasn't very good at them, but he kept going. "This is hilarious," Bronson said out of breath. Maggio was busting out perfect form push-ups with a determined look on his face. I watched him like I did back into orientation with the goal of just keeping up with him. "Stop!" the Black Hat shouted out to the formation. The entire group of Army infantry stood there trying to catch their breath. I felt the burning in my chest after 40. None of the SEALs showed any signs of slowing down. Up, down, the SEAL leader shouted. "Get up!" the Black Hat screamed. We continued the push-ups until 50. Then the group stopped and remained in the up position, or leaning rest in the special ops community. "You bunch of squids, get up!" screamed the black hat. Before I could comprehend what was happening next, the entire group of SEALs stood up and walked up to the black hat as they surrounded him. They picked him up and held him in the air like he was a crowd surfer at a concert. They walked him over to the side of the road and threw him into a ditch that was full of water. The black hat was on his back in the ditch. He stared up at the sky speechless, his uniform wet and muddy, and his hat about 3 feet to his side. All the SEALs dropped down again and started doing push-ups together with perfect form, and we dropped back down again with them. Bronson laughed so hard that no noise left his mouth. Maggio was back in his determined perfect form. The SEALs counted out every 10. After the incident, we ran in the formation like nothing had happened. The only proof that it did was the black hat's uniform was soaked with mud all over it. In the early morning hours, the day of our first jump, we formed up to put on our parachutes to be inspected by the jump masters. Arms on my head, I spun around as my equipment was fully inspected. I was feeling very nervous that morning, but not as nervous as I thought I'd be, considering I thought about that day for a few years. The day I could not imagine when I first joined the Air Force was upon me. I was going to jump out of an airplane. In the formation, the black hat gave us a briefing about the jump. Everyone will exit the aircraft. If you freeze up or are too scared, we will throw you out, the black hat shouted. If I got on the plane, I was going to exit out the door, and I wasn't going to land with it. I looked around at the Navy SEALs, Maggio and Bronson. They seemed fine. If they were scared, they were hiding it well. Bronson looked at me and smiled as he spun around with his hands on his head. His chute was given a final inspection by the jump master. "This shit's ridiculous," was all he said. As we boarded the C-130 on the tarmac, I had a strange feeling my brain was trying to work out. I was boarding a plane I would not land with. I stood there with my inspected parachute on my back and my reserve chute in front of me that I hoped I'd never use. Minutes from the time of boarding, my nervousness increased to a mild panic. At least I would not be the first one out the door because I was in the middle of the line. Being first would have been terrifying the first time. We all did a shuffle into the plane with our chutes on as we made our way up to the back ramp of the C-130. Its engines were running, and the distinct roar was loud as I entered the inside. There were benches on both sides of the aircraft that we squeezed in too tightly. It was a military aircraft, so it was bare bones inside. An empty fuselage like the inside of a semi-trailer, aside from red cargo nets. I heard the 4 C-130 engines rev high as the plane lifted off the ground. There were no windows, so I just looked around at everyone else on the bench across from me. Some stared straight ahead, some had their eyes closed. A few of the SEALs looked like they were already sleeping. Most of the Army looked terrified. I wondered how I looked. The sound of the back side door opening was loud. The daylight lit up the dim fuselage. I peeked around at the guys sitting on the rows of benches. I began to see the nervousness in everyone's eyes. Even the SEALs looked a little intimidated as the door opened. My heart was beginning to race as I heard the jump master yell, 10 minutes! His voice was so faint I almost had to read his lips. I was too far back to see out the side door, which was good. I could barely stand as the jump master yelled, 5 minutes! I stood and hooked my static line to the metal cable running above my head down the center of the aircraft. There was a light system that looked like a traffic light on the side of the fuselage, and it was displaying red. I was staring at the back of the guy's helmet in front of me. The loud noise of the door being open and the engines was deafening. Jumping out of a plane was in the back of my mind since I'd read the brochure in the recruiter's office, and it was just about to happen. I had a feeling of fear, excitement, and an uneasy feeling I forced my body to do something that felt completely wrong. I looked for the green light. I finally calmed down a little and used the same technique as the pool training. I took slow, deep breaths, and my heart rate felt a little better. "Go!" the jump master screamed. I saw the light turn green. There was a movement in the line in front of me. The airborne shuffle began out the door. The shuffle was exactly that. One foot in front of the other with little shuffle steps. I saw people going out the door. The jump master continued screaming as people exited the side door. It was getting closer. They sounded the windy doorway and the engines became super loud. I saw the ground, 1,000 feet below, and it rushed by. The pine trees looked like little twigs sticking out of the ground. I made the turn of the doorway and stared at my feet, but I caught a glimpse of the red clay and pine trees moving swiftly below the aircraft. I looked back down at my feet and jumped out the doorway. I wanted to yell loudly. It sounded like I jumped into a hurricane. The wind noise from the props and the speed of the aircraft caused noisy chaos for a few moments. I continued to close my eyes. I felt the tug of the static line pull the parachute. After a few more seconds, I heard the sound of the C-130 flying away. As I floated down to Earth, I looked around at the other jumpers, and they were everywhere. We invaded the sky. I heard the faint sound of someone yelling through a bullhorn and saw instructors standing in the field as they yelled at the jumpers. "Keep your feet and knees together. Look at the horizon. Do not look down," the bullhorn voice shouted. The ground came fast, and I prepared for the landing. I thought back to all the time practicing PLFs as the black hat yelled at me. "Keep your feet and knees together. Do not break your leg." I stared straight ahead as I waited for my feet to hit the ground. And finally, bam! I hit and rolled to the ground. I was actually surprised by how hard I hit, but I was okay. That was all I gave a shit about. For a moment, I didn't move. I felt an intense exhaustion overtake me because the adrenaline rush was over, and I felt a slight hint of nausea. I stared at the sky as I listened to the screaming through the bullhorns. "Keep your feet and knees together." All 5 required jumps were done the same afternoon. There was no time to reflect on my first experience. I had a few minutes to drink some water before we were getting our parachutes inspected again by the jump masters. The second time going up was scarier than the first for me. Before I had time to dwell on the next jump, we boarded the plane. It was a military. There was no time to slow down. Like the drills in the orientation course, I knew what to expect. I knew what the fear felt like seeing the ground below the aircraft as I threw myself out the door. I tried to remind myself that all I really had to do was jump out of the airplane, keep my feet and knees together, and of course, never look down. I heard discussion about the winds before we lifted off for the second jump. If the winds were above a certain velocity, no jumps were supposed to happen. Things could get ugly, especially with new jumpers with thin parachutes if the wind picked up. I hoped the jumps would be canceled for the day. The door opened again, and I heard the jump master shout, 5 minutes! The minutes seemed like hours, but the light finally turned green and the shuffle began again. I saw the first few go flying out the door, then the light turned red, stalling me after about 10 feet of movement. I saw the jump master waving his arms while I tried to read his lips. "Too windy!" the guy in front of me shouted. I breathed a sigh of relief. I saw the jump master intensely gazing out the door with a serious look on his face. Not the day to jump, I thought. I was already planning on what I'd do that night. I wanted to go out and drink a beer. "Go!" I faintly heard a shout from the jump master. It was so faint I only knew I heard it after the line was moving again, and the light turned back to green. The shuffle was back in full swing, and I turned to the open doorway. Like I went upside down on a swing as a child, I tucked my chin in and I grunted as I peeked out the door at the moving ground. I hesitated for a split second, but I jumped out, letting out a "God damn it" just above conversation level. I heard the loud rush of the wind again, and there was a tug as my shoe pulled. I heard the bullhorn, but that time the voice sounded more urgent. I looked down and I was actually overflying the pine forest that bordered the landing zone. "Oh shit," I said out loud. I knew from rumors that landing in a tree was bad. I pulled a slip, but it felt like nothing happened, of course. I tried again, pulling on the straps below the chute. I pulled and pulled, but the trees were coming fast. I took a moment to process that I would actually land in the trees. I did not have time to panic or think about what to do. All I could think was, "Thanks a lot, Army." It was too windy. The tops of the pine trees were almost at my feet. I was still in disbelief as I crashed through the top of a pine tree. I felt scratches through my BDU pant leg. The pain was almost non-existent because of the adrenaline surge. Once through the top of the pine tree, I realized that there were no more limbs toward the bottom of the tree. I fell through the top of the tree, but my chute was caught by the limbs at the top to slow my fall a little. I forgot what I was taught, but I was falling like a crash test dummy towards the ground. I looked down as my left foot hit the ground before my right. I heard a tiny pop near my ankle. I was on my back on the ground for a minute, just thankful to be alive. There was the sound of bullhorns and the airplane in the distance, then complete silence. I felt nauseous from the pain setting in on my scraped leg and a numb, twisted ankle. I got up to run back to the drop zone, but I limped slowly from the woods on that hot, sunny afternoon, which may have been my last training exercise of the pipeline. Something was wrong. I ran as fast as I could. The thought I couldn't shake was that if the fight on Easter Sunday did not end my hopes, the jump injury could have ended my career as a cone. I heard a shout from a bullhorn. "Hey, Air Force, are you hurt?" I saw a black hat standing in the middle of the drop zone, surrounded by several green chutes being packed up by jumpers on the ground. They could see Air Force in my BDU uniform. "Hey, Air Force, are you hurt?" he asked again. I thought I saw a smile on the mouth under the big black hat. I just kept looking down and shouted, "Negative, Sergeant." I limped through the open field of the drop zone in a panic and saw another jumper try to PLF on the ambulance driving around that produced a loud, hollow thud. I heard some laughter from the black hats on the sidelines, but they became concerned as he looked like a dead body falling to the ground. I may have found it funny, but at the time I thought jump school was pure bullshit. When I arrived at the area where all the other jumpers were telling their stories of excitement from their last jump, taking off their equipment and laughing, the medical personnel saw me sitting on the grass. One of the medical personnel walked over to me, but I didn't notice. I hoped the pain would fade away. I hoped that I just twisted my ankle. "Take off your boot, Air Force," a young man in Army BDU said. I did as instructed and pulled off my boot. My ankle began to swell up before my eyes. I couldn't process being injured and immobile. The fact that I could be removed from training made me want to crawl into a hole and hide. I was immediately taken to see the Army doctors at Fort Benning.